I have weaknesses that, are going to be impossible to overcome without someone else coming in to
where
do
we
that.
think about not just the interconnectedness, we think about interdependence in a very different way, which means if you sink, I don't swim.
Welcome to the Leader's Abstract, the podcast about the inner work of leadership. Here we explore the ideas, habits, and blind spots that shape how mission-driven leaders show up for their teams and the communities they serve. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Rutter. With me, as always, my intrepid co-host, Mr. Joe Tomaino. Joe, it's good to see you.
Same here, Jeremy, and I have my official Leaders Abstract mug now. Thank you very
That's
much.
great. We are official in the merch category here,
Yep,
and
yep.
I'm pretty excited about that. It's a good day. Joe, did I see recently that you're going to be speaking at the Financial Professionals Conference in Leading Edge, New York?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
That's
With my
great.
partner Jamie Rapps.
That's great. Are you the
Yeah.
keynote?
No, not the keynote. They know better.
Well, you got prime billing. I do have to say, you got prime billing on the. It would appear that you are the top dog in all of their marketing. So, congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I'll be
I
sure
look
to
forward to it.
drive up to that. It's always a good time
Good,
in
good.
Saratoga. Well, Joe, we do have a guest today, and would you be so kind as to introduce him to me and to our listeners?
Sure. Dr. Eric Hieger. So Eric's a good friend of mine, and we've worked together since I guess like 2007. Eric, we were together at McGladrey in New York City, and we got to collaborate on a few projects, and we've stayed both personal friends and business associates since. Eric's got a really interesting background, which I'll let him speak to a little more, but he took a clinical background in psychology and transformed it into a management development, leadership development practice. And he's worked in various organizations, the American Management Association, ADP, Kaiser Health, in terms of leadership development and program development. And Eric, I think the audience would probably be interested in hearing how you took, a clinical background in psychology and how you kind of pivoted into business psychology. How would you? And first of all, am I calling it the right thing? Like how do you categorize what you do, and how did you pivot to that, and what is your practice?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and happy to have this conversation wherever we take it. And Joe, yeah, so other than, when we first met, I had transitioned out of clinical practice and I had always run a dual path in business, had an interest in entrepreneurialism, had an interest in the scale of business, the challenges of business. What I didn't have as much familiarity with was the context. And somebody had scouted me as I was in my clinical practice, and I think saw potential in me that I didn't even really recognize at the time, that a lot of the skills that we use in clinical work, particularly in my background, it's clinical psych and neuropsych, and that much of that could be translatable to a different context and different population. And I think the big epiphany was, instead of working in very, very small quarters, moving into the business world where most normal people spend most of their time is where I could have the largest scale real world impact instead of in a therapy room, which is pretty much an artificial
Yeah.
setting
And,
and very focused.
and what I mentioned a few of the organizations you worked with. What were your roles there, and how did you take your clinical experience and make it practical for those businesses?
Well, I was drafted immediately. The first big step, which was a big leap, was directly into the consulting space. And so a combination of local family-owned enterprises and businesses to global fortune companies all over the world. And so I had incredibly quick access to very diverse experiences. And that was where I learned, particularly through a mentor of mine named Bob Evers. He was really the one that introduced me to the idea of leveraging psychology in practice. And that's where it all really began. And that was before you and I ended up in McGladrey together at that time in New York
Mhm.
City, which was my first, I would call it a very significant internal management responsibility job at that time. And then it kind of grew from there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Hieger, right now you're currently a CEO and managing partner of TransformX. And I see that you do management consulting, advisory practice, and you support executives and leaders seeking to elevate their leadership. Um, Tell me some of the things. It sounds like you don't do leadership development in the traditional sense. How do you approach leadership development, and how is it that most of us are doing that wrong?
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. Thank you, Jeremy. So, just to go back to Joe's question about, what do they call this? We don't tend to use organizational psychologist as a term unless somebody carries a very specific license, and a lot of that is determined state by state. Typically, we tend to think of it as organizational development as a catch-all or organizational effectiveness, and then we really dig down into much more specifics than that. And it can look like everything from Lean Six Sigma and business process improvement, continuous improvement, innovation work, all the way through to team development and conflict resolution, negotiation, mitigation, risk management. And in my world, what I tend to think of as cultural architecture, of which leadership development is a piece. So to make that bridge, you were asking about leader development or leadership development. It's interesting because the language matters. And traditionally, especially in the Western context, the Western mindset is very much biased to believe in individualism rather than collectivism. And it brings us to question the history of most leadership development focuses on the individual, potentially to a fault. And what we end up with is this fantasy, this notion that a leader is a composite of certain things, characteristics, qualities, traits, and behaviors that are modeled in a way where one leader is quote unquote better than another. And the question that we often have to ask is better for what? And in what context? And what we know from just endless amounts of research is that you take a leader who is incredibly effective in one environment and you move them to a new company, new situation, change a whole bunch of different variables, and their past success is not necessarily the best predictor of their future success. Then you go, well, wait a minute, if this was completely dependent on personal characteristics and qualities and traits, skills, competencies, then why shouldn't they be universally effective? And
Absolutely.
that's when we start to get into a much more complex conversation about the living system of an organization. What are the environmental factors that allow us to express leadership in a collective way that raises the entire performance, quality, standard of care, and so on of an entire organization as a living organism, as opposed to this idea that a leader, a singularity, is going to fix things. So that is the first major assumption to challenge, that most leadership development programs are very much about the focus on the individual, their career path, their competencies, their success, as opposed to what we're doing together. Yeah.
Eric, we've been talking about your academic background and about your corporate background. And meanwhile, we're looking at you in a Hawaiian shirt with a religious artifact around your neck and beautiful scenery behind you. And it seems incongruous. So why don't you talk a little bit about where you live and maybe more importantly, how the culture of that place has, formed you in terms of your approach to leadership. I know that there's a story there.
There is. And so thank you. I mean, the cultural aspects have definitely informed things. So let's talk about that experience. So I grew up in New York. I was born and raised in New York, spent most of my years there, and then I moved to California to do my doctorate and had a number of years there in clinical work. Then I came back to Long Island and I was an my pre-doc internship was at one of the world's largest inpatient psychiatric hospitals, which happens to be on Long Island. Not that far, Joe, from where you are.
Right?
Which is, let's just hope that's a coincidence. And so
Actually, I train my dog on the grounds there.
that makes sense. So eventually, when I moved to California, I met my wife, who is Native Hawaiian, born and raised here on Oahu in Hawaii. And ever since we met, we've been coming, and sort of a pre-arrangement and a condition, a commitment that we had made was that no matter where we lived in the world, we would come back at least once a year. And we never broke that commitment. And after we had kids, even though the kids would be immersed in the culture for 2 to 4 weeks every year, it's not enough necessarily to carry the value of the immersion in the culture, the ancestry, the family system, and then uh, things that really help shape people in their worldview. And we thought that that was really critical. So by the time, Joe, that you and I met, we had been in New York for a little while. And we stayed in that area because there was a lot of opportunity for career development over a number of years. And when Kaiser Permanente recruited me, that was the first legitimate opportunity we had to come back home to Hawaii. So that's what explains this is formal dress attire for where we live, and this piece that you mentioned, it's not a religious artifact. It's more like anthropological and historical artifact. It's essentially a fashioned fishhook that was hand carved for me uh, more than 25 years ago as what I would consider to be almost like a welcome into the family, the culture, a bit of a rite of passage, being as somebody who's not of native ancestry. So that's where I operate from now. And we've been
And
here for a number
how
of
is that
years.
how is that how has that culture influenced how you see leadership?
Um,
Or has it?
It it's a different look. I've been really, really fortunate to be able to work uh, with my own team spread out around the world, and then work with organizations with global influence and presence. And I think my endless fascination with cultural anthropology and my background in that area leads me to be maybe as or more curious than most. And the values that are here really bring this idea of kind of tribal connectedness very much to the forefront, and interdependence very much to the forefront. And this idea of this rugged individualism and notions of personal success are very much less appreciated in this kind of environment. And it's a really solid reminder to consistently go back to, if not your own values, to really understand the values of the people that you're working with. And I don't mean values just in a very ambiguous sense. I mean in a very literal sense. How does that inform the way that we take up our role, either as a teammate, as a leader, as a follower, as a server, whatever the role identity is, it's an expression of values. A lot of us don't really spend a lot of time thinking about that, not just our personal values, then the collective set that helps us create an identity, a shared identity that then leads to a sense of belonging. That happens to be in Hawaii a very face forward kind of phenomenon, as opposed to someplace like New York,
Yeah.
where that is not the primary agenda. The primary agenda is more self-centered, self-directed. And I'm not using that in a harsh judgmental way. It's just simply an orientation. It's not good or bad. It's just different.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, that individualism that you reference, that is where we see a lot of leadership development going. And I'm going to individually go to a leadership academy. I'm going to improve, self-improvement, even in the title in itself. It is, I'm going to improve myself so that I can lead this company or lead my team to success. And there's ownership there.
Yeah.
And again, we use it in terms of ownership, my team, right? As opposed to
Yeah.
terms of collectiveness. I just worked with my team on the Working Genius. We just went through I don't know if you're
Yeah.
familiar with Lencioni's Working
Hmm.
Genius
Hmm.
profile. And I think that's kind of a good start into what you're talking about, which is that collectiveness, because it does really examine kind of the interconnectedness of leadership. And what you're really doing is, yes, it's called Working Genius, but really we're looking at our flaws and how do we balance our flaws with our teammates that are together. And one of the more interesting items that had come up when we went through this Working Genius is um, my working geniuses and my working frustrations, we were exact opposites to my executive assistant. And so we complemented each other
Yeah.
exactly opposite.
Yeah.
We were the only two in the group of 10 that had that exact, kind of synergy. And it's great because I really, and I've said for many years, I have weaknesses that, um, are going to be impossible to overcome without someone else coming in to do that.
Mm.
And so, that's that kind of collectiveness that I think you're referencing to.
Yes, it's really interesting because I think if I'm noticing myself and even my reactions to what you're saying, Jeremy, there are certain things that trigger me in ways that are helpful to indicate the bias. One of those is this idea of weaknesses. And what we see even in Lencioni's work, which of course is foundational kind of work, whether the title, The Five Dysfunctions, for example, was brought up as a way to sell more books and get more attention, or whether it's really the way that we orient to the world, it almost doesn't matter because people will amplify certain kinds of language. And one of the things that I started in pre-med, that really was my original path. And I think candidly, what didn't sit well with me was looking at the entire world through the lens of pathology, constantly looking for problems. And this idea of problem solving is a very capable, important skill that people can develop. Except when your whole worldview is oriented to problem solving, then all you do is look for problems. And the challenge with that is that it can create blind spots in opportunity, in strengths-based approaches, in building healthy and health optimized living systems where we think about not just the interconnectedness, we think about interdependence in a very different way, which means if you sink, I don't swim. So rather than trying to mitigate weaknesses, we try to figure out how to bolster and, like you said, create complementary strengths that give us the best likelihood of reducing variables and creating the circumstances that we can be successful together, not successful at the expense of or in spite of. And those are very different mindsets. And that brings us to the question about the mindset of leadership, not just the leader. Who are we together? Not just who are you and what difference are you going to make? And how good are you compared to other people? And what is your career path? And what is your next move? And what are you in succession for? The question is, what are we committed to here? Are we committed to our path individually, or are we committed to a path together where we're truly, as you said in the beginning, mission centered? And that brings into question, where is the orientation? In healthcare, we like to talk a lot about person-centeredness and human-centeredness and true servant leadership. Well, if that's really true, then what is the expression of that as a collective? And how do we get into this design of a collective that is a reflection of things like values and behaviors that are expressly identified, not a figment of somebody's sort of character and personality. It's not nearly enough.
So, Eric, if many of our listeners, viewers are executives in healthcare organizations, and what is the approach that you would recommend that they take to strengthen the leadership of their team? I mean, I imagine it starts with, as Jeremy's done, with some sort of an assessment. But what what would you prescribe as a path that a leader should consider in moving their team forward?
One of the things if we use really very plain English, one of the most challenging things that often doesn't happen is the collective we, whoever the we is that makes some kind of a leadership team, sits in a room and says, who are we? What do we believe in? And what are we actually doing here? Not what are you each doing here? How did you, in other words, this mindset of how did you earn the right or have the privilege to be seated at this table or to have a place in this room? That's not the right question. The right question is, who do we define as the collective we? And what are we doing in service of whom and what? So some people kind of lump this into vision, mission, and strategy kind of work. I think before you get to that, you need to start with a sense of identity, which is basically values, the definition of culture, beliefs, behaviors, values, and assumptions, the ways that we see the world. It's not that we have to be always in agreement. We need to be aligned minimally on directional core. And there are plenty of times where, of course, we're not going to be in agreement or in alignment. And then the next question is, what skills do we have to fall back on, as well as commitments that we've made to one another that allow us to navigate that conflict? Usually that conflict, we see conflict as not a slamming of heads or friction that just breaks things. When we think about conflict in our work, conflict is just simply when your needs and wants differ from somebody else's. That should be happening on a very regular basis. And the question is that fuel for progress and for forging strength rather than division? And that has to be clearly identified as a set of commitments that we make toward one another and how we're going to work together. So your question about how do we even start, I have a model that I'd like to share with you that I think hopefully it'll be useful for anybody who's listening to this. We call it the 3Cs model, which stands for context, culture, and climate. And much of this comes out of consulting history as well. There's nothing really radically new. It's a question of how we use it. And if you think about it as a Venn diagram, context sits on top and it's larger than culture and climate on the sides. Context is king, queen, and court. It helps you understand everything. And typically in traditional consulting fashion, Joe, you'll laugh, right? Our usual approach in any kind of consulting is you drop us into any new environment. The first thing we ask is, so what's going on around here? And that's how everything starts.
Right.
And so context is not just what's happening now. There's a time and space dimension to context, which has a lot to do with what happened before, what's happening now, what do we anticipate is going to happen in the short and near-term future. And that's a dynamic kind of assessment. Culture and climate are interesting because climate is literally like the weather. It can change at any moment in time. It's highly volatile, very fungible, and it can have a mind of its own. And it can very, very, very consistently, very quickly. Culture tends to be very slow to change and embedded and much more difficult. And if we break down culture further, we break it into, if we had an operational definition, a lot of people use the word and have no idea what it means. And then when we talk about it with each other, nobody really knows what we're talking about. When we break it down, we look at it in terms of really doing a forensic on beliefs, behaviors, values, and assumptions. That's not just an individual exercise, it's looking for the collective expression of those things creates what we experience as culture. And that determines very much about not just our operating philosophy, our actual performance. And our job is to connect all that together and then figure out if what you have today is really, really working. Is it optimized exactly the way that we want? Or are there things that you want to change? And if there are things that you want to change, why exactly is that? And what specifically do you want to achieve and what would success look like? And then we begin to define the bookends and then we figure out how to work backward from OKRs, objectives and key results, specific goals, success metrics and measures, any specific set of agreed upon outcomes that are determined by an interdependent leadership body. Strat planning of days gone by is dead. It's irrelevant. We used to think about things in terms of 3, 5, 10-year timelines.
Yeah.
That's only helpful for very long-term visionary direction. Other than that, uh, the goals that we set this week could be irrelevant by next week. And yet we're still hooked into these ideas of annual performance cycles and goal setting and cascading or waterfalling goals and objectives. The world we live in now is profoundly different than it was 20 years ago, which was profoundly different than it was 30 years before that. And it's so trite to say that the pace of change continues to increase. Trite as it is, it's accurate. And so the question is, well, should we be paying attention to that? And if we should, and that's part of the leadership responsibility, well, what does that actually mean in terms of how we practice this art and expression of leadership in a collective sense? So there's a lot to look at. Your question, do we start with assessments? We prefer to, because it starts with that question of what's going on around here. And then it gets a lot more sophisticated than that the closer we look. And this is where the background in psychology, sociology, and anthropology really matter, is that we know how to systemically study these things. And once we do, our job is not to collect data. Our job is to make sense of what is this? How do we make sense of it? Where are the narratives that create this phenomena? And now, most importantly, what do we do with it? It's kind of rude to say, so what? When you're presented with data, though, that's always our first question is, so what? Like, there's a whole bunch of information. The so what is the transformation of information into insight.
Absolutely.
Now, the next thing is beyond the so what is the now what, which is we have to go from now information insight to action.
Absolutely. I use that phrase quite often, not only in my work, but also quite often when I teach, and I teach research methods, I teach nursing home administration, but really in the research methods class, when I'm trying to distill down and teach the students about research problems. And so we'll talk about something and I'll say, okay, well, tell me what the problem is. And I'll say, so what? And then they'll
Jeremy,
rephrase it, and then they'll say, so what? Until we get down to the base problem,
yes,
and you can distill it down 5 or 6 times. You say, so what? Who cares? Why is that important? Probably a nicer way to say it is, why is that important?
Yeah.
So what is a little more impactful to that? Or who cares? Why does that bother me? Why does that matter to me? And you do that 5 or 6 times, and then the student gets down to that real research problem, which is there's an inconsistency here that we need to address.
Yeah. So I'm really curious from both of you, if you talk about research, qualitative versus quantitative, do you still find that there's an inherent bias toward one being more valuable than the other? And how do you employ them in the real world for your bodies of work?
Oh, absolutely. There's a huge bias towards quantitative research. We have to have, metrics and outcomes, even for items that should be, quality of life and quality of care. And we've made this into a quantitative metric. And so really it is quite a huge bias into that direction that, numbers are what matter, because we can measure it and we can measure your performance. Because if you can get to, the 95th percentile, then you've achieved gold standard. But from a qualitative point of view, it's much less valuable. You can't justify.
Yeah. I've studied military leadership, particularly how the military has adopted a lot of Margaret Wheatley's work in terms of chaos theory. And the military has had to really pivot, because it used to be that the grunt in the field had time to report what they see and report it up the line to a field officer who reports it to a command center, and they get direction on how to proceed. The modern soldier today, is at the front line, not the guys doing logistics support in the back that have high school degrees, but the guys at the front line have master's degrees and are in their late 20s and have about a fraction of a second to make a decision about whether to engage the enemy or not. So the Army has had to switch from, this very linear command structure to one where they promote decision making by the front line. And I think in healthcare it's so important. We have a nursing assistant who's in a room with a patient who's presented with some issue. The patient's trying to get out of bed or whatever. We can't afford for that nursing assistant to have to come down the hall to get direction on how to proceed in that situation. We need them to make the right decision at that point. And a lot of the military approaches to doing this is through after action reviews. They do mock exercises and then have a collective discussion about how everybody reacted in that decision, in that circumstance. Eric, I know you've incorporated after action review in a lot of your work with healthcare organizations. And, to me, that learning that comes out of that is just as critical as what comes out of an academic research. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you approach after action reviews and how administrators, leaders in healthcare could incorporate that into a learning environment for their team?
Yeah, for sure. And I want to tie up a loose end from a moment ago about the quantitative qualitative bias, and this will feed into the after action review piece. With the intensity of evidence-based care and the way that we think about metrics, measures, and all the objective criteria, the thing that often gets lost is the subjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about elevating the caregiver experience or care partner experience, as well as the client, patient, community member, family experience, so much of that is qualitative. We try to proxy it into quantitative, and oftentimes that's a mistake. Rather than fighting the bias and declaring that it has value on its own in a complex composition of data. So an after action review looks a lot like this too. And it usually starts with, at least in the business context, what are we talking about? What are we reviewing? This could be on a daily basis, a weekly basis, and hopefully not only for critical incidents. We use it as an ongoing learning capture system, not an after action review when something's gone terribly wrong and it's part of an investigation. So when we use it as an ability to really constantly observe, identify, extract value, and get better as an improvement process, a continuous improvement process, it tends to be less critical and less judgmental and less fear invoking, and much more about what went really well to get the results that we got. Were those in line with the results that we anticipated getting or that we set out to achieve? And what were the, let's call them enablers or optimizers, the things that helped us get those results? And what were the blockers or the things that got in the way? And how do we make sense of those? What we try not to do is obsess over the why and the why not. It's a real look at what actually happened, a forensic, from an objective point of view that's not severely loaded about who's at fault. when these things don't go well, we end up with a symptom that we call blame storming. So what happens is all kinds of deflection, people sort of hiding, not just errors, omissions. And when we don't have an environment of psychological health and emotional safety, there's a lot of withholding and deflection and other kinds of things. The after action review is a way to desensitize, or let's call it make much more acceptable, that we can share versions of truth that we get to an understanding that we can learn something from. So the after action review is a very disciplined, consistent process that when people participate in it, it leads to a sense of equity and equality, and with a common understanding that we're supposed to come out of this better, having actually learned something that we can apply today and tomorrow from what we learned from yesterday, without obsessing over the past.
I mean, Jeremy, the rubric you went through of continuing asking why, to dig deeper. Eric, is that a similar type of approach? Well, I think I heard you say though you don't keep asking why. I mean,
well, it
depends
on how it's interpreted, right? And so in an environment where people are audit minded, where your leaders particularly are constantly focused on deficiencies and what's missing and what needs to be improved, you end up finding yourself in an environment that is the opposite of quote unquote catching people at their best.
Yeah.
How do you find the way to sort of recognize and amplify and reinforce all the things we want to see more of and that support success, rather than we over-index or get overly focused on the things that are wrong? So depending on the culture, remember we talked about the 3 C's: context, culture, climate. If those things are biased toward more of the gotchas and the deficiencies and the not up to standards, then the question why becomes very threatening. If you're in an environment where learning is the standard, where this idea that we're ever improving and that we support each other to be successful no matter what, then the why is not nearly as triggering. So it's not just the word, it's the intent behind the word.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. And so we live in in the nursing home world, Department of Health world. We live in a very negative environment.
Yeah.
Our performance is based upon a number of deficiencies, how few deficiencies you can get. And so even the language is,
Absolutely.
you're not the worst, right? That is our goal, is to be not the worst. And we're allowed to only 10% of us are allowed to be the best, right? Even with the 5-star rating system people can say, 90% of nursing homes don't hit the 5-star rating, right? But that's because that's the way the system is set up.
Right.
I'm not the nursing home administrator of record at our nursing home that just went through survey today. They just exited.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So the first time we had survey post consolidating 2 nursing homes into one. I think it went very well. Of course, every survey, 99% probably surveys do come out with deficiencies. I think the days of deficiency-free surveys are over, especially.
Well, you want at least a couple of Ds to keep them from doing a validation federal survey.
That's right. But Eric, what you're saying, it's really kind of, made me brainstorm this thought of, my staff just went through this week of negative interrogation. What are you doing wrong? Let me watch you and let me, write. And at the end of the week, I'm going to sit everyone in a room and tell you everything you did wrong. And if you're good, we've only caught 6 or 7 things that you've done wrong. However, in that week period of time, I've probably had 110 employees, do thousands of things right. And so, as you're talking, I'm thinking in my head, boy, I would love to do the anti-survey next week.
Yeah,
I would
Yeah.
like to go
that's exactly
through
right.
and do an anti-survey and then do an exit survey of here's everything that you guys did right this week. Here is,
Yeah.
your 5-star moment of, you know what? John showed up to work only 10 minutes late today. Like all this positive talk, right? John showed up to work today. Um,
He
Well,
showed up.
he
well,
showed
there.
up, right?
So
But I jest in that, but
yeah,
there is a ton of incredibly positive things that, even right in this minute, 5:50 p.m. on a Friday, that a CNA is doing something right in a nursing home right now. And no one is celebrating that. And I think we
Yeah.
should turn that page and turn this into an anti-survey next week and really try to
yeah,
celebrate that.
yeah. I think you're highlighting something so crucial, which is that is entirely your discretion. That is not just the leadership choice. It's a leadership responsibility. What are you role modeling? What are you focused on? What do you amplify? And for what reasons? And what are you reinforcing? And when we're talking about situations in most of our healthcare environments where we are, quote unquote, battling compassion fatigue and chronic and acute trauma and burnout and all these negative, more deficiencies, more things, instead of looking at it as a personal defect, it's a failure of an individual. I would consider that a failure of leadership. We are not creating the conditions, the culture, and the climate for people to thrive in the kind of way where we champion health and optimism and positivity and reward the things that are always going incredibly well. The word deficiency alone is pathological. And so when we keep using words like that, and I understand there's technicalities and there's reports and there's things that are standard, I would, this is just my personal bias, I would put those to the absolute minimum.
Yeah.
Because the more that you talk about them, right, the more we focus on, the more we get. And if you focus on something, the more energy you put into it is the more it's going to feed that kind of mindset. The reflective mindset of a living organism is a collective expression, as we said in the beginning. And a lot of that is going to be role modeled by the very specific language that you choose to use, the behavior that you demonstrate, and the behavior that you reinforce. And if that is not surgically prepared and professionally applied, what we have is tremendous inconsistency. And now we're back in that trap again of, well, this one particular leader is an optimist, and this one is a realist, and this one is always skeptical and a pessimist. And therefore, we like working with this one person, and we don't like the experience of working with another person. And you're going, well, depending on what level of quote unquote organizational leadership we're at, how much of that expression is acceptable for the way that we define the we, the place that we're in, and also the environment that we cultivate. It's ours. So the question is what's acceptable and what is not acceptable in those environments? We can't leave that to an annual performance review or a one-on-one evaluation. That has to be a collective agreement, a set of agreements and a collective expression. That work is difficult work. It's very personal, it's very human-centered, it is more qualitative, and it's enormously difficult. It's a lot easier to just set a goal.
Yeah.
It's a lot more difficult to do the real work of relationship building and also then community building. And if we believe that that's the core of how we're going to be successful together, that has to be a shared belief system that then gets expressed through behaviors and through actual sort of the right kind of evaluation rather than the standard performance evaluations of your individual contribution or not. And that calls into question lots of other things that we assume have to be baked into modern day work. So conversations, I'm sure, for a different day.
Yes, I think
Well,
we could go on and talk forever about
yeah.
these fascinating subjects. And Dr. Hieger, if people wanted to follow back up with you, pick your brain, learn about TransformX partners, where would they be able to find you?
The best place is to find me through LinkedIn or through either of you. They can contact and find me that way. LinkedIn is the best way, and I'm very visible. So easy to contact through there.
That's
Thank you for
great.
asking.
Absolutely.
Happy to have
Jeremy,
any
this
conversation.
this may be our first repeat guest.
I believe so. I think we do need a part two in this. I'd like to thank you for listening to the Leaders Abstract podcast. These episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to me or Joe or Dr. Hieger on LinkedIn. All three of us are there. We've been your host, and this has been the Leaders Abstract.